An ARPG endgame system and an interesting open world seem incompatible. It is the Diablo 4 endgame paradox. Blizzard, however, is trying anyway, and so far it is not a success. I think I have a pretty good idea why it isn't working and why it may never work. This video is about that idea, this paradox. I'm going to structure this video in two parts to explain it all. First, I'll describe what I mean with endgame in an ARPG and talk a bit about Diablo 4's lack of endgame. Second, I'll talk about why endgame and the open world seem so incompatible. Part 1. Endgame. The term endgame seems to originate from games like chess, which existed a while before ARPGs did. It refers to the stage where only a few pieces remain on the board, and it is by definition the final stage of the game. In gaming, the same term is used also to describe the final stage of the game, usually after other stages of that same game have been completed. You can literally reach endgame, typically after completing the campaign, for example, or the main quest in an MMO, or by reaching max level. This is true for ARPGs as well. Endgame starts when the campaign ends. Looking at a few ARPGs, we can see this time and time again. Path of Exile, there's a campaign and then endgame. Last Epoch, a campaign and then endgame. You have a bit more freedom there, you can already start endgame without finishing the entire campaign, but typically players reach around level 45 through the campaign before they dive into the monolith. Torchlight Infinite, same deal. First the campaign, then the Netherrealm. Diablo 4 has two issues if you compare that. One, it made the campaign optional, and in the process of giving in to player feedback and letting them determine the solution, the devs removed the demarcation point between the early and end game. And perhaps worse, issue number 2, it has no real end game. Diablo 4 is basically this in Season 2. You create a character, you skip the campaign, you skip everything really, you already have 11 passive points and 25 paragon points, and you grind a few dungeons or start doing the blood harvest at level 1. 20 hours later, at my pace at least, you're level 73 and almost nothing has changed. You're doing the exact same content against the exact same enemies, and your build has evolved a bit, sure, but a necromancer at level 15 isn't all that different from a necromancer at level 55. Nightmare dungeons at tier 36 are no different in terms of gameplay than a regular dungeon at level 6. It's just slightly more annoying because there's a lightning strike which you need to avoid by standing in a dome. But that's not progression, that's not moving from early game to end game. It's making the game harder and more annoying without offering actual new content. With no mandatory campaign anymore, and no real progression or phases within the game to speak of, Diablo 4 is a homogeneous game without much variation or novelty, without much of a progressive journey, without the idea that you're getting stronger as a character due to enemies scaling with you at some point. Plus, the way progression is implemented, whether it's a battle pass or the seasonal journey, which isn't a journey but a checklist, makes the lack of progression even more obvious. You're not going anywhere, you're just striking through topics on a grocery list. And it's not hard to see, you only have to look at the competition to realize something is missing here. What Last Epoch has is the monolith of fate. It has a clear path of progression. You unlock the timelines by timelines, you make your way through all of them, unlock empowered timelines, and then farm those, and that is where the endgame falls flat in terms of progression, but at least there is endgame. At this point, Last Epoch suffers from the same issues as Diablo 4, because 400 corruption doesn't play any different than a level 68 timeline, it's just more tedious. However, before you reach that point, you're clearly working towards something, and the game has an obvious campaign and endgame system, and the sense of progression is there. Torchlight Infinite has the Netherrealm, which works in a very similar way, unlocked once again after completing the campaign. Also here you unlock more and more tiers by playing the endgame, you can customize the content in the maps and have a lot of freedom there in which type of content you encounter, and you make your way to the actual pretty brutal endgame, unlock more and more bosses, and it's yet again a journey, and a pretty fun one, but I'll make a video on that someday as well. Path of Exile, the endgame king, has multiple of these systems which unlock after playing the campaign. Some are standalone like Delve or Heist, but the main endgame system is the Atlas of Worlds, where you gradually progress through the tiers, encounter more and more bosses and have vast customization options how to play the endgame. Diablo 4 has nothing that even comes close. It basically completely lacks endgame, and it completely lacks this sense of progressing from a campaign to a new system, because campaigns are optional these days. It's just one massive grind from start to finish, and even the XP increases can't prevent the feeling around level 70 or so that this game simply isn't going anywhere. I mean, your character in the game and also the game itself. There's just no point in playing. Small sidestep, but something PoE, Last Epoch and Torchlight have in common is a visual representation of the game. You can see the monolith islands, the Netherrealm levels and the Atlas of Worlds in a user interface. I think it's a small detail and it doesn't serve all that much of an actual functional use. You could see other ways to run maps in Path of Exile without the Atlas UI, basically like Diablo 4 works with clicking on a dungeon, but I feel this user interface, which all three games have, unlike D4, is important to experience that sense of progression. It might be minor, but it might also be very significant. So, we've established what endgame is and talked about Diablo 4's endgame. Let's talk about part 2, the endgame in Diablo 4's open world, and the actual paradox here. This video is not about whether open world as a design choice is a good or bad thing. We've passed that station, it's in the game, there's no changing that. Plus, personally, I thought I would hate it, an open world ARPG, but I've come to appreciate it since launch, also seeing how detailed the world is and how much passion went into creating it. I'm genuinely having fun grouping up with random players, doing some content, blasting the screen, it's pretty good. The open world as a concept turned out way better than I expected. It's not about that, though. It's about something I realized, an unforeseen consequence of Diablo 4's open world. At least I think it's unforeseen. What in particular opened my eyes was the implementation of the new bosses. D4 is focused on an open world, rather than a common hub or town that you see in other ARPGs. It is about an entire living, dynamic world which is shared across everyone on the server. It's quite unique in that sense. And the only game I can think of is Lost Ark that has something similar, but Lost Ark is a different genre of game. It's an MMO with an isometric view. I know of few, actually no ARPG hack-and-slash games with a completely shared open world. While the open world is great for events, world bosses and exploration, assuming you enjoy that content, and even great for teaming up and doing Helltide, red or green, it turns out it's not a substitute for an actual endgame system. The open world can never be something like the Atlas or the Netherrealm or the Monolith because it is shared. In order for an endgame system to be meaningful and that progression mean something to you, that system must be personal to you because it's your journey through that endgame system, which doesn't mean you can't do it in co-op, but you simply can't have it in an open world, I think. Unless some genius figures out how, and maybe part of the answer lies in how strongholds do differ depending on whether you conquered them, but still, I think you'll agree that the open world is not designed for an endgame purpose, definitely not in Diablo 4. All events planned in the open world are great, but they're disconnected, disjointed and ultimately without much purpose. I'm having fun in Helltide for maybe its duration, which is an hour, but then I am more than done. Nightmare dungeons are okay, but there's no meaningful progression there, only a tier number in front of it. In order for Diablo 4 to have me playing more than 3 days per season, there needs to be a robust endgame system which entices you to keep pushing your character beyond the initial building stage of that same character. Now, some people I'm sure would argue that a random Uber boss or the new bosses are actually endgame. I don't think so, but let's say they are, just indulging that argument. How do you get to that endgame? Well, you need boss fragments. And how do you get those? Well, you need to kill world bosses, do Legion events or do Helltide in order to get those boss fragments for 4 out of 6 bosses. But these activities are not always available. As a matter of fact, they usually are not available. It's quite revealing actually that the new bosses are locked behind events that aren't always available because a Helltide only spawns every hour and you need that for boss fragments. Legion and world bosses are only up every so often and you need those for boss fragments. The idea of boss fragments is solid and taken straight out of PoE, but the execution of the system is very poor and a result of the open world design. I can completely understand why you can't have a world boss spawning every 5 minutes, that would just be pointless, It makes perfect sense that in order to have this dynamic, living, interesting open world, you need dynamic things to happen, like the timed events, because an open world with timed events is likely more interesting than having them being up all the time. However, tying your boss fragments to such a system immediately shows why that doesn't work. All of a sudden, I can't determine that I want to farm boss fragments. Instead, I need to wait for a timer. A timer that indicates which event starts, so I can start farming. It's taking away player agency in a little endgame available, if you even want to call it that, and it feels awful. Things like boss fragments should be farmable 24/7. It can't be dependent on arbitrary timers, but you require those timers for an interesting open world. They do serve a purpose in that sense. And so there's the paradox. Blizzard will obviously not get rid of the open world, and they shouldn't. It is a unique feature of the game and a selling point in my view. But Blizzard does need to get rid of this idea that the open world needs to play a role in endgame because the two are not compatible, which I tried to argue in this video. They're paradoxical. Instead, they're probably better off as a company creating an entirely separate system for this, similar to how basically any other ARPG is doing it, and keep the open world for what it's designed to do. Cool events, co-op play, exploration, that. And I hope they will. Perhaps BlizzCon already has announcements moving in this direction. And that's it. Thanks for watching and making it to the end. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Love you all. See you soon. Bye bye.